There are rooms in London that remember everything. The ballroom of Caldwell House is one of them. Its mirrors have watched 1,000 engagements bloom and wither. Its chandeliers have burned through 100 seasons of hope dressed in silk. On the night our story begins, those same crystal lights blazed gold over velvet and pearls, over champagne lifted by gloved hands, over laughter that concealed, as laughter in such rooms always does, the quiet machinery of judgment. And into that golden cruelty walked Duchess Marybeth Vandermeer. She was 45 years old, though one would not have called her old, not if age were measured in grace rather than years. Her gown was the deep wine of late autumn, her dark hair threaded faintly with silver she refused to hide, for she had decided long ago that dignity was not a thing one apologized for. She had once been the woman every eye in this very room turned toward. Tonight she would learn how quickly a room could turn away. The matchmaking mothers had arranged it, a quiet introduction murmured behind fans between the widowed Duchess and London's most coveted bachelor. Duke Alexander Caldwell, 38, recently titled, devastatingly indifferent to the parade of debutantes thrust before him season after season. It was meant to be discreet. Society, of course, ensures that nothing remains discreet for long. A handsome match, surely, one matron whispered behind painted silk, though one wonders if the Duchess hasn't seen rather more seasons than suits a second engagement. The words traveled, as they always do in such rooms, not loudly, but inevitably the way poison travels through water. They reached the Duke before Marybeth had even crossed the floor toward him. And so, when she arrived before him, her curtsy low, practiced, dignified, the Duke did not offer his hand. He offered instead a sentence. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying further than perhaps he intended, perhaps not caring that it did, "but I find myself disinclined toward arrangements better suited to autumn than to spring." The orchestra did not stop, the candles did not dim. And yet, for the space of one held breath, the entire room seemed to lean inward, hungry for the moment unfolding before them, the quiet collapse of a woman's composure performed in public, for sport, the way Romans once gathered to watch something fall. Marybeth did not flinch. That perhaps was the cruelest part of all, that she had endured enough seasons, enough losses, enough quiet griefs in private rooms, to know precisely how to keep her spine straight when the world wished to see her bend. Her chin lifted, not in defiance, but in the practiced economy of a woman who had long ago stopped giving strangers the satisfaction of her tears. "Then I shall not trouble your grace with autumn's company," she replied, her voice steady as poured glass, "though I confess autumn has buried more men of consequence than spring has ever made." A ripple of scandalized laughter quickly smothered behind fans. Someone's champagne paused midway to their lips, and the Duke, for one fraction of a moment, unguarded, looked at her not as an inconvenience to be dismissed, but as something he had not expected, a woman entirely unafraid of him. It did not matter. The damage of his words was already loosed into the room, already multiplying into the kind of story London feeds on for weeks, the Duke who would not have the aging Duchess. By morning, it would be ink in scandal sheets. By evening, it would be laughter in drawing rooms she would never again be invited to enter without it trailing behind her like a shadow. She turned, she walked. Each step across that gleaming floor was its own quiet act of war. The silence behind her louder than any orchestra, every eye upon her back a small, cold blade. And it was there, at the threshold between ballroom and night, beneath the great arched doorway where candlelight gave way to darkness, that her glove loosened, and something small slipped from her trembling fingers unnoticed, a fan, modest and unremarkable to any other eye in that glittering room. But not to his. The Duke watched it fall. He watched the crowd close around her absence as though she had never stood among them at all, as though 45 years of grace, of grief endured, of quiet survival, could be erased by a single careless sentence spoken to please no one but his own vanity. And yet his feet carried him, almost against his own will, toward the small fallen object she had left behind. He bent, he lifted it. The ivory ribs were worn smooth with years of use, not the trinket of a girl chasing fashion, but the possession of a woman who had carried it through every joy and sorrow of a life fully lived. He did not know, not yet, why his hand refused to release it. He did not know that he was holding, in that moment, the first thread of an undoing far greater than any ballroom whisper could predict. He only knew this, somewhere beneath the practiced cruelty of his own words, something had cracked, and cracks, however small, have a way of letting light in where none was ever meant to enter. Scandal in London does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way frost arrives upon a window, first a single delicate line, then a spreading lattice no hand can erase before morning. By the second day after the ball, that single sentence spoken so carelessly beneath chandelier light had already crept into every drawing room of consequence, copied and recopied like a verse everyone wished to recite, yet none wished to have spoken of themselves. The Duke who would not have the aging Duchess. It appeared, thinly veiled in the scandal sheets, a cruel little column comparing Marybeth to a rose pressed too long between the pages of a forgotten book. It appeared in the murmured delight of women who had once curtsied to her, who had once sought her counsel on matters of taste and bearing, and who now found it far more amusing to discard her than to remember her kindness. Cruelty, the narrator must observe, is rarely born of malice alone, more often it is born of relief. Relief that the world has found someone else to judge, so that, for one season at least, the judgment will not fall on them. Marybeth bore it the only way a woman of her composure knew how, in silence, behind closed doors, where no audience could witness the cost of her dignity. In the privacy of her townhouse on Berkeley Square, she sat each evening before her fire with her correspondence unopened, her tea untouched, her reflection in the darkened window the only company that did not require her to perform serenity she did not entirely feel. It was into this quiet that the first token arrived. A small parcel delivered without card or seal, left upon her doorstep by a footman who could not or would not name his master. Within it, her own fan, the one she had lost that very night, its ivory ribs polished with careful, deliberate hands, as though someone had spent long hours turning it gently in candlelight, unwilling to let it go. Tucked beneath the ribbon, a single sprig of late-blooming heather, and beneath that 4 lines of verse in a hand she did not recognize, unsigned, restrained, yet carrying a weight far beyond their brevity. They spoke not of beauty fading, but of beauty mistaken, of seasons wrongly judged by those too blind to count their worth. Marybeth read them twice. Her pride, sharpened by years of practiced armor, refused at first to soften. Some cruelty, she murmured to her companion, Mrs. Whitfield, wears the costume of tenderness rather better than tenderness itself ever could. I will not be made sport of twice in 1 week. And yet she did not burn the verse. She placed it instead within the drawer of her writing desk, closest to hand, though she would not have admitted why. Across London in the cold stone quiet of Caldwell House, the Duke stood before a portrait he rarely permitted himself to study, his late mother. Painted in her 39th year, her eyes carrying the same unhurried dignity he had glimpsed, however briefly, in Marybeth's gaze before he had wounded her. He thought, too, of a girl he had admired from a window seat in his youth, before duty and title had taught him to measure worth in seasons rather than in souls. He had not known, until this week, how thoroughly that lesson had corrupted him. "You are a fool, Alexander," he told his own reflection in the firelight, "to have rejected the only woman in that room who did not flinch before you." His valet, entering to inquire after the carriage, found his master in a temper he could not name, sharp with his correspondence, distracted at his club short, with the very peers who now pressed him half in jest, half in genuine curiosity, as to whether the rumors of his secret gift to the Duchess held any truth. "Tell me, Caldwell," drawled Lord Pemberton over cigars and brandy, "is it true you've taken to courting widows with poetry now? I confess I should like to know what madness has overtaken you." The Duke's reply, delivered with a stillness that silenced the room far more effectively than any raised voice could have done, became, though none in that smoking room yet understood its weight, the very words that would later be repeated, softened by time, as the truest thing he had ever said. "I did not reject her years, Pemberton. I rejected my own foolishness in not counting them sooner." The laughter in the room did not come, only silence and the slow turning of a man's reputation from villain to riddle. But London does not allow riddles to remain private for long. Within days, a scandal sheet, more imaginative than honest, printed its own distorted account of secret tokens exchanged between the disgraced Duchess and her unlikely admirer, embroidering tenderness into something scandalous, something neither Marybeth nor Alexander had ever intended for public eyes. Reputation, once a private possession, had become public currency once more, and both of them now stood to lose everything they had spent a lifetime protecting unless they could face, at last, and in private, the truth neither had yet dared to speak aloud. A meeting could no longer be avoided. Rain in London does not announce itself gently. It arrives as confession arrives, reluctant, then sudden, then impossible to hold back. On the evening the meeting could no longer be avoided, it fell in silver sheets against the windows of Caldwell House. Where Marybeth Vandermeer stood in the doorway of the library, her cloak still damp from the carriage, her composure, for the first time in this story, visibly trembling at its edges. She had not wished to come. Pride had argued fiercely against it for 3 days, citing every wound, every whispered humiliation, every column inch the scandal sheets had spent dissecting her dignity as though it were a garment to be unpicked thread by thread. But curiosity, and something far more dangerous than curiosity, had won the argument in the end. She wished to know not for society's sake, but for her own, whether the verse pressed into her hand had been mockery or mercy or something neither word could fully hold. The Duke rose from beside the hearth the moment she entered, and for a long breath neither spoke. The firelight moved across the room the way firelight always does in moments meant to be remembered, softening hard edges, gilding what daylight would have judged too plainly. Maribeth's eyes found the writing desk near the window, and upon it unmistakable her own fan still cradled in its ribbon, still bearing the sprig of heather now dried but carefully preserved. "You kept it," she said, not a question. An accusation, perhaps, though her voice did not carry the sharpness she had intended. "I could not seem to do otherwise," the Duke replied, and there was none of the careless cruelty in his voice now that had filled the ballroom days before. "I have tried, your grace. I have told myself a dozen falsehoods this week, that I returned it from mere courtesy, that the verse was a foolish indulgence, that I think of you no more than I think of any acquaintance wronged by careless words. I have failed each time to believe a single one of them." Maribeth's chin lifted, that same practiced defense that had carried her across the ballroom floor unbroken. "Then perhaps your grace ought to practice his falsehoods with greater diligence, for I came tonight expecting an apology, not a confession I am ill-prepared to receive." "Then let me offer both," he said, crossing the space between them with the slow deliberation of a man approaching something he feared to startle, "though I suspect only one of them will matter to you by morning." He did not touch her. He stood close enough that the firelight caught the silver threading through her dark hair close enough that she could see for the first time that the coldness she had believed inherent to him had never been coldness at all, only the armor of a man who had spent so long being measured by his title that he had forgotten how to measure others by anything other than the same cruel arithmetic. "I have watched you, Maribeth," he said, and the use of her given name, unadorned by title, struck her more forcefully than any declaration could have. "Longer than you know. When I was a younger man, foolish and unformed, I watched you cross a ballroom not unlike this one and thought I had never seen dignity wear silk so naturally. I told myself then that a man of consequence does not waste his ambitions on admiration alone. I built my life instead upon calculation. What alliance would serve, what match would flatter, what wife would be young enough to be molded rather than already, infuriatingly complete. And when your name was placed before me this season, I did not see the woman I had once admired. I saw only a number. 45 seasons weighed against younger numbers, and I judged you unworthy before I had even allowed myself to look at you properly." Maribeth's composure, so carefully maintained through every insult London had offered her this fortnight, began at last to falter, not into tears, for she would not grant herself that surrender even now, but into something rower, something that had waited years for permission to be spoken. "Do you know," she said, her voice low, edged with a grief older than this single humiliation, "what it is to be counted, weighed, and discarded by a world that once adored you for the very things it now uses to dismiss you? I was admired once for my beauty, my wit, my bearing, and I am despised now for nothing I have done, only for the simple, unstoppable crime of having lived long enough to grow wise in their absence. I have buried a husband, Alexander. I have buried friendships that proved as shallow as the punch bowls they were poured beside. I have learned, through grief no ballroom could ever witness, precisely what my worth is, and I will not have it diminished by a man's careless arithmetic, however prettily he dresses his regret in heather and verse." "You should not have to," the Duke said, and something in his voice broke open entirely, the careful composure of a duke giving way at last to the unguarded honesty of a man. "I did not reject your years, Maribeth. I rejected my own foolishness in not counting them sooner, not as a flaw, but as the very measure of everything I have spent my life pretending not to want. A wife who is already whole. A woman who does not need shaping because she has already shaped herself through fire I was too sheltered to ever know. I called it autumn that night, meaning it as insult. I understand now that autumn is not a season of ending, but of harvest, of everything a long, well-lived year has finally allowed to ripen. The rain struck the windows harder now, as though the sky itself had been listening and could no longer contain its own answer." Maribeth did not speak, could not, for the words rising in her throat were too large, too long withheld to trust a voice just yet. But her hand, when it moved toward the fan upon the desk, and then, hesitating only a moment, toward his. "Society will not forgive this easily," she whispered. "They have already named us scandal." "Then let them," the Duke answered, his fingers closing gently around hers, "for I find I would rather be scandal beside you than respectable beside anyone they would have chosen for me instead." Outside, the rain began at last to soften, not ending, but easing, the way grief eases when it has finally been spoken aloud rather than carried alone. And in the firelight of that quiet library, two people who had each spent a lifetime being measured by a world too careless to look closely, allowed themselves, for the first time, to be truly seen. The narrator, watching from beyond the reach of time, offers only this: that society's judgments are written in chalk upon stone that the next rain always washes clean, while love, true, unhurried, hard-won love, is carved instead into something rain can never touch.